Hi, Misha here, and this spring, you've seen this gun around a lot. The Springfield Hellion Creation VHS-2, and we've brought you a couple of videos on it. And something else you're going to see, anytime a Springfield product is mentioned, there are many comments about not liking Springfield, about their politics, about them being traitors to the 2A community, and how people no longer will buy their products. So let's talk about it. What did Springfield do? What did they say? What have others said? What have they contributed to our community? And what have they done that was duplicitous? So we're going to look at various guns that they've done, namely imports. This being the most recent, of course. Alrighty, very first shots out of the Hellion. She held open.
Brass down my shirt.
Hellion, second mag with a mag pull. She held open.
Yeah, looks good.
Not a bad trigger, really. And then, yeah, just, kind of assess the situation. It's often said in comment sections, but do you really know what big crime Springfield did? You may not, or you might think you know, but you might learn something different. Who knows? Let's find out. And with that, let's go back in time and kind of talk about the very beginnings of Springfield Armory Incorporated. M14.
Go ahead.
M14. Well, the Springfield Armory, when it comes to rifles, is probably most well known for this. Also known as Steve Barciaci's favorite gun, the M14 M1A 7.62 NATO. Now, mine here is actually an Arms Corps receiver with a build on it, but I've had plenty of Springfield guns from straight commercial to SOCOMs and Scouts and all that. So I'll give Jero some photos and he can throw some up so you can look at them. You probably know what an M1A looks like. But actually, Springfield Armory did not come up with it initially. Back in the late 60s, several things happened. The original, the real Springfield Armory, U.S. government, opened in 1777, finally closed its doors officially in 1968, although it had been selling off its production lines since 1964. In fact, it sold its M14 line to Taiwan. And after that, the name was free, and a gentleman by the name of Elmer Balance, bought the Springfield name, or at least ended up with the rights to use it, and adapted it to his company, LH. Now, they were in Texas. Early on, they were in Austin, I believe, might have been Houston, but very quickly they moved to Devine, which is where you'll see the earliest M1As. This was the ATF-approved semi-automatic receiver because, of course, an M14 receiver, it falls under the once a machine gun, always a machine gun thing. So they had to do one. Now, interestingly, even the earliest M1A receivers were investment cast. They were not forged like the M14s. The ATF gave approval around 1971, and so the Texas Springfield Armory Incorporated started introducing the gun. But it would not build that many because in 1974, the whole thing would be sold to the Reese family headed by Bob Reese, later his two sons, Dennis and Tom. And they would end up with the Springfield name in the M1A product line. So they didn't start it, but they really expanded it out. And over the years, they would build a lot of guns using a mix of commercial parts, for example, National Match barrels of different weights, and GI parts, bolts, bolts, op rods, stocks, and the number of commercial parts and military parts would kind of ebb and flow as they would buy surplus. They bought a big batch of surplus M14 stuff in the early to mid 80s. So between like 85 and 95, there's a lot of military parts in their guns. And then between like 96 and 2001, the parts started to really dry up. They also got a lot of parts from Israel, including some to make the Israeli sniper rifle system, which had a 6-power Nimrod scope on it. And they would sell these as special edition kits, about 600 of them. Pretty cool. I don't own one, but they really brought the M14 and National Match and all that, of course, along with Fred's M14 stocks, which I've talked about in the past. And that's what they became famous for. And it's worth pointing out that the M1A was not as impacted by the 1994 assault weapons ban as other guns because it never had a pistol grip. The only thing they really had to do was remove the bayonet lug, and it was good to go. So that actually gave it some credibility in the 90s that other guns may have lost, having to have thumbhole stocks and what have you. So that was kind of Springfield's first big contribution to our hobby or passion or right, a semi-automatic service rifle from the U.S. military, the M14 M1A, be it from Devine or Geneseo, Illinois. But that was, of course, domestic. What interested me and what I've noticed were their imports. And this is what they don't always get credit for. They brought over some really nifty stuff in the 1980s. So let's take a look at a few things. In the 80s, a new fangled gun, or rather a series of guns, from Germany, a little-known company known as Heckler & Koch, started to become popular here. The HK91 and 7.62 NATO, and to a lesser extent the HK93 and 5.56, and the HK94 in 9mm. They were considered somewhat pricey at the princely sum of $600 to $700, and so Springfield, already a little bit in the import game, worked with EBO in Greece, the Hellenic factory set up to produce G3 types for the Greek army. Well, Springfield worked with them to make a semi-automatic version, essentially an HK91, but quite a bit cheaper, and frankly, of really good quality. The biggest difference between a 91 and what they called the SAR3, this had the original phosphate finish, whereas the German gun had the later enamel baked-on type finish. These had the plastic handguards, and they were offered with either a fixed or a collapsing A3 type stock. They fed from standard mags, and they had about a 17.7 inch barrel with standard threads held on with the tines, pretty HK standard. And just like with an HK91, no bayonet lug, although I've added one to mine. And Springfield would sell the SAR 3 from 1985 up to 1989, when the infamous assault weapons or assault rifle import executive order was signed by George H. Bush. That's actually how my rifle came in here. This is an SAR 3/8 overstamp. These are so-called cotton customs guns, and were a small batch that were eventually more or less grandfathered in. They were sold with all the parts, but it was kind of a some assembly required type thing. It's a whole story we can talk about. And they were followed in 1990-1991 by the SAR 8, which was a true post-band style, came with a thumbhole stock, and it had a barrel with the threads bobbed off. So it's actually a slightly shorter barrel, a little under 17 inches. So restoring those is a little more difficult. Now, to be fair, Springfield also assembled some SAR-8s in the USA using a mix of parts, and these have a bit more of a mixed reputation. But the whole series was shut down at the beginning of 1998 when President Bill Clinton added to Bush's executive order prohibiting the importation of guns with double stack, essentially, or high capacity mag wells, limiting them to 10 rounds. And there was no good way that they saw to still make it work. And so, like a lot of importers, they gave up the ghost. So yeah, Springfield brought over some roller lock or roller delayed guns in 7.62 NATO 308 and a few different flavors, and they're pretty cool. These Greek guns are great shooters and great, you know, kind of project type pieces. And for a long time, they were very reasonably priced. Even the SAR-8s are good quality, but of course they had to comply with the 90s. It's often said that the 94 assault weapons ban impacted this. This is not true. That was domestic stuff. These were impacted by the various import changes. And of course, you know, you have the G3. Well, Springfield didn't want to leave its competitor out in the cold either. Springfield did not neglect the FN-FAL either. Now this is my SAR-48 match, or SAR-48 HB. We'll get to that in just a minute. But their prime product was imported from Brazil, manufactured by Imbo, once had a license from FN. And this was just called the SAR-48, and several versions came in. Most were the 21-inch fixed stock, so analogous to FN's 50-00. But there was an 18-inch carbine, or bush rifle, as Springfield called it. Actually, very handy configuration. And they would bring over some paratroopers as well, both with the 21 and 18-inch barrels. So good selections. Now all of these are in 7.62 NATO. And they're all pure Brazilian imports made from new parts. Mine here is a little different. This was actually quite possibly my first pre-man FAL ever bought. And it's an interesting story because it's built on an MBEL receiver, Type 3. And this is imported, and it's built with an Israeli heavy barrel or Maculon parts kit. And it's assembled in the USA by Springfield, but it's all imported parts because these were done in the 80s before the 89 ban, so no worry about 922R or any of that jazz. And this was one of the few heavy barrel or FALO guns available in the 80s, and quite a bit cheaper and pretty cool besides. So this joined the SAR-48 lineup to give them a heavy barrel. They didn't bring a heavy barrel over from Brazil. Again, still in 7.62 NATO, feeding from standard 20-round mags. There are 30-round FAL mags, but it does not seem like the Israelis ever use those. Now, of course, the 89 ban would impact FALs much the same as HK guns. And so the SAR 4800 was introduced in the early 90s. And this would see the product line go down in numbers quite a bit. There was the basic thumbhole stock 21-inch barrel model, but it was offered now not only in 7.62 NATO, but also 223 5.56. So that's kind of cool. But these two would end by 1997. And yeah, it's a lot of gun, but it's also a lot of fun. So there's several things that Springfield Armory Incorporated added to the market, and it has to be said did so at very competitive prices. That was the idea, to compete with HK, FN, and others, and do so at a price just about anyone could afford, kind of how the Chinese did AKs. But it did not end there. Now we'll let Jero give the Hellion a go.
on that one?
Hellion. Alrighty.
It's been running clean as a whistle all day.
As indeed. Did you know that Springfield was the third importer of the Israeli Galil? No, this isn't one. This is my kit gun. They're actually quite uncommon because only about 1,000 came in between 1991 and 1992. They would have a GS marked serial number, presumably Galil Springfield, and they would bring over several models. There would be the 386 or 386S. There would be the model 710S. Those were in 5.56. And there would also be a 308, a 7.62 NATO version, known as the 329S. S, of course, standing for Sporter. These guns would all come in without the cool stock. And even though there would be an ARM style with these handguards, I think they would usually lack the bipod. For a while, bipods are considered a no-no feature too, but that kind of got left upon. But yeah, everyone knows about Magnum Research and Action Arms, but the fact that Springfield brought over a batch, a little less known. It was pretty brief. I get being overlooked. But you know what? I thought it was worth mentioning that they did that as well, because who doesn't like a Galil? And it technically shows that if you want to consider this an AK, they even got into the AK game. They really kind of put their finger in every pie to see what would stick. And with that, we'll move on to our final Springfield rifle series from the 80s, and then we'll come back to modern day. BM-59.
That seemed to work better.
You know, maybe almost as closely identified with Springfield as the M1A, the Beretta BM-59. And if you follow the channel for a while, you know this is one of my favorite guns. Chambered for 7.62 NATO, magazine fed, and based on a modified M1 Grand system. Many, myself included, consider this to be what the M14 should have been. But while a few were imported from Beretta, like the BM69 and BM62, these are very sporter versions and brought over in very small numbers. It wasn't until the Reese family, still being led by Bob Reese at the time, worked a deal with Italy. They were getting ready to retire their BM-59s and surplusing a lot of old goods. They bought tons of stuff. Receivers, barrels, stocks, parts, magazines. They started brokering the deal in the late 70s. By 81, it was announced. By 82, the first guns appeared. By 85, they were kind of being advertised everywhere. Much like with that SAR-48 match, they were assembled in the USA, but using most all Italian parts. Some, like mine, are on a Beretta receiver. Others are on receivers that were said to be incomplete forgings from Italy that were finished out by Springfield. And some are said to be based on Springfield's M1A receiver modified to work here. In any case, they're all legitimate and very cool guns. And these are the first BM-59s with full military type features, including the bipod, different muzzle to brakes, and they offered tons. This is the basic Mark I. They also offered a Mark II with a pistol grip stock, Mark III with a folding stock and longer barrel, or a Mark III paratrooper with a slightly shorter barrel and folding stock. They even offered a Mark IV, so-called Nigerian, which is very similar to a Mark II. And I've read tale that they did some BM-59E types, but I've never seen one myself. The point is they assembled quite a few BM-59s using Italian parts in the pre-ban era. And they would continue to do so into the 1990s, even after 1989. Because the receivers were brought over before the ban, most of them were considered pre-ban receivers, so they could keep putting them together for a while. In 1992, Springfield Armory would divest itself of its BM-59 product line, but all their assets would be transferred over to RSI, another Reese company offshoot, and they would continue to offer various BM-59s and parts into the 21st century. Although by like 2005, they were really running out of parts, and by 2010, RSI themselves went out of business. But for a time, Springfield was the place to go for anything BM-59, and looking at some of their old ads and stuff, they had some cool options and ideas. And they wouldn't make parts, for example, pistol grips if they didn't have enough, but if they had original parts, they would use them. And it's a system I really like. And it's interesting that they did these, which could have been considered direct competition to their own M1As, but they did them anyway because it seems like they were really, really focused on options. So we've kind of covered most all of the 7.62 battle rifles all in one company, and they were priced reasonable. These were a little more expensive than the others, but then again, nice quality. And that's kind of where things rested for a long time as far as imported rifles, until we get back to the Hellion. BM-59, last smack of the day. Gyro again with the Hellion.
Shorten that up just a little bit. Hold open on that.
Now, it was not just rifles that Springfield imported, manufactured, sold. In fact, even in the 80s, they were interested in the 1911, and that became their bread and butter into the 1990s. And then in the early 2000s, they introduced this little known pistol called the XD, which was a rebranded HS-2000 from Croatia, which was their service gun. And this became quite a successful line for Springfield. And you started to see rifles kind of taking a back seat. And they did get into like the AR-15 and stuff, but yeah, the pistols were kind of what they were being known for. Plus the M1A continued, especially like newer versions like the SOCOM. But then in 2020, 2021, this gun was announced. And it was quite interesting because we had never seen a semi-automatic VHS-2. Chambered for .223. We've covered this in a lot of videos. And to get around current import regulations, restrictions, and all that, what they're doing is bringing over parts from Croatia and assembling them here under license, essentially, using some American parts, barrel, I think, things like that. And of course, making a few modifications to make it more appealing for the market, they think, like using standard pistol grips, feeding from Stanag mags, that kind of thing. And yeah, this was just introduced, and there's been a lot of videos, and including with ours, we've done them, so that's that. No reason to talk more about it here. But it's always neat to see something new, and it makes sense given their close relationship with HS Product in Croatia. So it'll be interesting to see how this does long-term on the market. I've noticed bullpups are kind of, they start off real strong. People really want them because they're new and weird and different. But then they die off pretty quick. So we'll see where we're at in a couple of years with this. But as I said at the beginning, anytime you post a video review of a Springfield product, people comment about how they're traitors and how they won't support a company. So, I guess we better get into the politics of it all. Ugh. Okay, let's try to start off with the facts and what was published and said, and then we'll get into opinions and maybe what I think. Like I said, the assault weapons ban wasn't too rough on the M1A. But going back and looking, Bob Reese left, and Dennis Reese became the CEO. Tom was around for a while, then he went off and did his own thing. Dennis Reese is the 21st century CEO, the one we really care about. Back in 2006, after the federal assault weapons ban sunset, the governor of Illinois talked about doing a state assault weapons ban. And Dennis Reese put out a statement saying that they were categorically opposed to this, and if it passed, Springfield would leave the state. Now, just prior, a couple of years ago, before that, along with Rock River, Springfield funded an organization known as the Illinois Firearm Manufacturers Agency, IFMA. And this was meant to be a lobby group to support the needs and interests of, well, you guessed it, firearms manufacturers in Illinois. So no shocker there. And for a while, this whole system hummed along just fine. Springfield introduced new products and would periodically do things like make donations. They made a pretty big one at the Camp Perry shoot in 2007. There was some other stuff. Of course, they said things when talk of assault weapons bans came up in 2013 and moving forward. The controversy we're talking about dates back to April of 2017, so 5 years ago. At that time, there was a bill for the Illinois state government that was basically a licensing bill. It was a Firearms Licensing Act. Essentially, on the federal level, all FFLs, all stores that sell guns, all manufacturers that make guns, have to have a license from the U.S. federal government. This bill would have extended that system to the state of Illinois too. So not only would a manufacturer or a store have to have federal licensing and a state business license, they would also have to have a state firearms permit, either to sell or manufacture. This was seen as not good. California does something similar with their CFD system. They have kind of their own NICS check in California. I can tell you right now, it doesn't do anything. It just costs money. And so there was kind of a redundant system just like that. And of course, that gets into FOID cards and everything in Illinois. It's not good. And at first, IFMA, under the behest of Springfield and Rock River, opposed this bill categorically. But then things did change. Now, the lobbyist for the IFMA was Jay Keller. And again, this agency was funded and started by Springfield, but was not directly Springfield. And Springfield was giving them funding. There's no question about it, even through 2017. The problem: the IFMA negotiated an exception to this proposed new law, this bill, this act, that would exempt Illinois-based manufacturers from the process, as well as, some say, big box stores, retail stores, chain stores, meaning that really the only ones that would be inconvenienced, even put out of business, would be small mom and pop manufacturers, small mom and pop independent gun stores, and of course they would probably sneak in little things besides that. Here's the thing: even though it got quite a ways, it was ultimately vetoed by the governor, so it never happened. And oftentimes this is the case with a lot of this legislation, and that's the end of it. Not this time. This is where things blow up towards the end of April 2017. It's revealed that the IFMA negotiated this exception, which would mainly benefit its clients, Springfield and Rock River, seeing like they were doing the, well, I got mine, Jack mentality. They got what they wanted and hanging out others to dry, using their political weight, because Springfield is a big employer, a big income earner in the area. It's important. Well, was this really the case? Did Dennis Reese did Rock River and Springfield tell IFMA to do this? That's the question. By the facts, they claim no. Both companies released statements around May 1st and following up a few days later, even video statements, saying that there was a, quote, failure of communication, that they were unaware of what IFMA was negotiating until after the news broke and it was already done, and that they had lost trust and faith in the organization. Essentially, it went rogue. It was doing things they didn't approve of, and they reaffirmed their support for the Second Amendment and our community, and both companies pulled out of IFMA, which dissolved the organization because they were its two real clients. So if they're not supporting it, it's dead, it's gone. So it was over for the organization. In the middle of the month, around May 16, the CEOs of both companies went to the state legislature to protest the bill and would continue to release statements against it. Now, what really happened? Was this just damage control because their closed door, backdoor, shady dealings were brought out into the light? Or were they really the victims of miscommunication or kind of innocent dupes in this all? We don't honestly know. There's not a fact one way or the other. It is rather convenient that it would have benefited them, but we weren't there. So it's kind of up to what you want to think. All right, so to kind of get a different perspective, brought J-Ro from behind the camera out front and just give a little discussion of today's video topic.
Well, on the one hand, I can really understand why people in the 2A community are concerned about any kind of incrementalism. The feeling that any kind of surrender to any sort of gun control measure is the first step on a slippery slope. I think a lot of those concerns are well-founded. And I think that there's a call for solidarity in the 2A community to always take a principled stand against that kind of intrusion on our 2A rights. That being said, it seems to me that when you've got people in the community who want to have the perspective that there's some kind of unforgivable sin that's been committed, that I will always personally boycott Springfield products and I'll trash their reputation wherever I can. There's a phenomenon in our culture that people are painfully aware of called cancel culture.
What can culture? What's that?
And it's the idea that that the best way to exact some kind of retribution against a company that behaves in ways that you don't like, disagree with, go against your principles, essentially when they are actors in the political sphere or in the social sphere, that the best way to handle that isn't through boycotts, take your money out of the system, but to launch a campaign of long-standing reputational damage. And the thing that's so egregious about cancel culture is that it's a system without redemption.
That's what I was saying. What do you think there's ever a time frame? Like,
sure.
We will penalize you for 6 months, 6 years, or is it?
And if we're going to criticize cancel culture writ large because it's so unforgiving, because it's so black or white, you have stepped over this boundary, this rule, that to the point where even a public apology, even a reversing of course on things, isn't enough. It's never enough. You are canceled forever. I think you've got to if we're going to be critical of cancel culture, we've got to watch out for that kind of behavior among our own ranks. I think it's important to bear in mind, first of all, that they are kind of already subject to operating in a hostile environment. Because even though there are a lot of red state areas in Illinois, all Illinois politics are ultimately Chicago politics.
Not unlike New York. I mean, upstate New York
Absolutely.
is a very different area from New York and Long Island, New York City and Long Island, Manhattan, yeah.
I mean, if there's anything that Springfield's guilty of, it's doing business in a state that contains Chicago and Chicago politics. And it's very much a go along to get along buddy system, back alley kind, not back alley, back room kind of negotiations. Most of the moving and shaking in Chicago politics happens behind the scenes. And it's entirely a matter of access. If you aren't going along with the established politics in Chicago, it's really easy for them to cut you out of any kind of consideration altogether.
I have a question. What do you think a company like Springfield or like anyone in the gun business, what takes supremacy as far as their priorities? Should it be protecting the Second Amendment or making profit?
It's kind of an unusual industry because there aren't a lot of businesses in which they traffic in a constitutional right.
And something that also has ethical, moral implications as well.
I mean, that's almost like saying what is a news network's primary responsibility? Is it to be an advocate for journalism and the First Amendment and freedom of speech, or is it to be a business? And they find themselves in that unenviable position of being both in a lot of cases. I understand the outrage. I do. I also think that we should be a little better about picking our battles and understanding the kinds of pressure. You asked me which one is more important. And if taking a principled, completely uncompromising step against gun control incrementalism has to be the priority, then going out of business would have been the alternative. And I think that they were faced with... It's always difficult for a company to make knee-jerk reactions to changes in the political environment without making some mistakes.
And to be fair, we can pretty safely assume there was some backdoor dealing because, yeah, Chicago. Sure. But we really don't know what was done, said, and...
No, that's true. We don't know if there was a quid pro quo in there somewhere, right, what it entailed. And just from the way that Chicago politics and their attitude towards gun control goes in general, I'd imagine the quid pro quo was go along with public support for this or we're shutting you down. It very well may have been a reaction to what they perceived as an existential threat. Now, I think their initial offer of, hey, if you go forward with this, we're pulling our business out of this state and we're moving to Texas or Florida or wherever. And that may have been the right move, but that's no small thing.
No. Well, for one thing, maybe some of your employees will go with you.
Maybe
some
not.
Won't.
I mean, that's an incredibly expensive proposition. It's very time-consuming. Production's got to shut down during that amount of time where you're making that transition. And would people have been understanding if Springfield said, hey, we're going to have to pull certain things out of production for a while, or making this principled stand against an encroachment upon the Second Amendment is going to be incredibly expensive and our prices have to reflect that? You know that it caught heat for that too. The gun community is really passionate about companies they support versus companies that they disapprove of. And a lot of it just has to do with I'm loyal to the gun that I own.
Yeah, because if you think about it, there's been a scandal for just about every company.
Oh, sure.
Colt multiple times. Smith & Wesson with the Hillary holes in the 90s. Ruger with statements from Bill Ruger. Ruger still held the task for things that their now long deceased owner said. It's like he's gone.
Yeah. And I'm not opposed to holding companies to task when they behave in a way that strains your ability to continue to support them on a ethical, moral, political position. You know, I get it. I understand why people would be upset. But we can't let ourselves fall into the same kind of cancel culture trap that people are so deeply critical of on, let's say, the left side of the aisle. They made a mistake. We all make mistakes. And
the thing is, we don't even know exactly
what the real details of the mistake were.
A mistake was made, but was it out of ignorance or not observing their representatives closely enough, or were they dealing directly shady?
It almost sounds like the criticism is that they came out with the right principled stand, and then I'm not going to use that particular word, but they suffered from a sudden lack of courage and resolve to back
money
away from.
Will do that.
It will do that. The threat of losing your business altogether will do that, or the possibility of having to relocate everything from production to management to a completely another location. They were put in a bad situation, and while I think there's plenty of support for the idea that they should have handled it better than they did, I also think that they've done a lot of incredible good for the 2A community, and eventually an apology and a correction and course of action. It's not like they're going to forget this.
No. And, like I said, if this had just happened, sure.
Right.
It's been half a decade.
Yeah. People are holding a grudge longer than I feel like they should. And at the same time, if the way that you choose to support the Second Amendment and to maintain your own gun ownership rights is to take a stand against Springfield, that's fine. Everybody's entitled to their opinion about that. But I don't think that it means that Springfield should be just erased off the map of gun production. It's not like they should be cast out into the abyss and never allowed to return.
And the hot take to me, a more unforgivable thing would be a company that continues to make subpar guns.
Oh, sure.
That break, that waste customers' money, that are potentially dangerous.
And that's clearly never been their tack.
No, and I'm not saying they don't have problems. But no, their products have more or less been pretty much good to go, and as affordable as any decent quality can be. That too is just, I guess to me, on my mind, I look for quality. The politics of it, I just don't get worked up over too much. I guess because I don't expect anything great out of any company.
Sure.
I'm not terribly let down when they don't do exactly what I want.
Like I said, I do understand what the ire was about. I still think it pales in comparison to like Dick's Sporting Goods.
Yeah. Well, and how often does any politician, run on a pro 2A platform in, November?
In Illinois?
Or any state, and then get in and nothing changes.
Well, and see, there's another interesting contradiction there. If you believe in states' rights, if you think that regulation in general should happen at a state level where it's most directly accountable to its voting base, then at a federal level, maybe it would be better if individual states like California, New York, Illinois had more aggressive gun control laws, and federally they left us the hell alone. And so I think the biggest mistake, like I said, is being set up in a place where you've got some of the most violent crime gun statistics in the entire world,
Well, as I said, the Reese family factory, before it was even Springfield, was in Illinois in the early 70s. Not that was a garden, but they have deep roots.
Right.
And they are, if you look at the local community, they're deeply embedded in their local community. If they left, it would have an impact.
Oh, absolutely. And there is one other criticism about making the claim that they're an American company employing American people, and yet all of the stuff says stamped made in Croatia.
Well, some. I mean,
not all of it,
the XDs and all that certainly do, yeah.
Yeah, I can see how that rubbed people the wrong way, but it's not like they don't have steel and CNC machines and engineers in Croatia. If the parts that they were ordering and bringing in and tuning up, reassembling were broken down pieces of shit, I can understand why they'd be like, don't claim to be a well-made American product.
They've always had import. I mean, they dealt with Imbel, they dealt with South Korea at various times. Importing has always been, and I'm going to tell you, it's not easy. Importation, it can be a fool's errand sometimes. There's a lot of paperwork, there's a lot of upfront money, there's a lot of risk. It's stressful.
And you practically need to hire an entire legal team just
Oh,
to,
absolutely.
just to keep track of what's going on with different export regulations.
One thing, too, that's kind of neat, it's still nominally a family-owned business.
Yes, and at the end of the day, they are still employing Americans. They are distributing their products to the American gun owner.
And I guess for me, one reason I always had a relatively positive thing, as I said, they let me afford guns that I would not have otherwise. I couldn't afford an HK91. I couldn't afford an FN FAL, but I could afford an SAR-3 and SAR-48. And so that kind of gave me a positive feel. I don't know.
And I think if I had to sum it up, I would rather see them learn their lesson from this, and for us to forgive them, than for companies like Springfield to just disappear.
And I will say again,
if the 2A community isn't going to support them, nobody is.
And you know, so many years down the road, one of the benefits we can see where they've turned. They haven't. I haven't heard anything negative on the political front.
Not lately.
Even after the whole Biden getting in thing, I don't feel sold out. And they have continued to not only sell their existing products, but look for new ones like the High Power and the Hellion. And
the Hellion, sure.
And the new operator. It seems like they are continuing to expand their product line. And there are other companies that are doing good work too, but they're one of the, I don't know, top half dozen in the country.
I think bygones be bygones is probably the right attitude to take about it. The message has been heard. They understand that. Maybe it's made them a better, more conscientious participant in the 2A community as a result, and that's a positive you can take away from it, but not if you maintain a lack of forgiveness and redemption.
I guess I would say, too, on the consumer level, on the individual level, what's really your end goal? Is it to hold someone accountable come hell or high water, or is it to see the Second Amendment protected and all of that? If you want to see, at this point, going after them is counter toward the Second Amendment. I don't see any advantage to that. They have weight, they have money.
It's not like that one infraction means that they are now an enemy of Second Amendment rights. They are still very much an ally and a participant in Americans exercising the right to defend themselves.
And they make guns, and you can say, well, a lot of gun companies make guns, but they make guns for the commercial market. Some gun companies make guns for the U.S. government or whatever.
Or for the very high dollar collector market.
Yeah, they're making guns for the middle class average person.
And I don't want to see that go away.
No.
I think they learned the lesson, and it's just time to let it go.
Yeah. So the whole point of this video, if this was a recent event, sure. But this is an event now over 5 years old. And it still keeps getting brought up. And I wanted to give perspective. I do not know. As J-Ro rightly pointed out, Springfield's in Illinois. And Illinois politics are dominated by Chicago. And Chicago politics have always been dirty. No shocker there. Did Springfield, through the IFMA, do a little backroom dealing, and if they got caught, they had plausible deniability? That is certainly possible. Or was IFMA acting without direct authority or knowledge of Springfield and Rock River? Guys, that's also equally as possible. None of us know, and it doesn't seem like concrete evidence will ever come to light one way. In the latter case, Springfield's innocent. If in the former case, guys, I don't see it as a punishable by death offense. They were playing dirty pool in a state known for dirty pool. They got caught. What did they do? They owned up. They released videos. They dissolved IFMA. They took their lumps. Reese got on camera, took responsibility. Kind of reminds me of that BP apology video. He did his contrition. How long are people going to punish? We all make mistakes. We all have lapses in judgment. we all fuck up. At worst, Springfield fucked up 5 years ago. Let it go. Because every company on earth will disappoint you. You know why? Because they're not moral institutions. The whole idea of any company, firearms included, make money. And they're going to do whatever they can to make money because corporations are amoral at the best of times. Springfield included. These are not individuals. This isn't your father, your brother, your son. This is a corporation, a company that makes guns to make a profit. That doesn't mean they also cannot be pro 2A. And honestly, I think they are. Throughout this video, I've shown you several cool imports that they've done, including their FALs, which were actually the first way I was able to own a pre-ban FAL because FNs were too expensive. Same goes here. Back when HKs were $3,000, you could get one of these for under $1,000. They brought affordable guns to Americans for decades, and they're quality guns too. They're not a fly-by-night delivered junk crap. And they've got a pretty darn good warranty, and they do employ a lot of Americans. Yes, they import, so they have foreign parts, but they also do a lot here. I guess my attitude is if someone asks for forgiveness after a while, I tend to give it to them. Because life's too short to hold grudges. And if you expect everyone to be perfect, if you have either it's 100% or 0% mentality, eventually everyone and everything will be 0% for you. And you'll be living alone in a van down by the river with lots of cats. I think the good Springfield has done outweighs the potential bad. Should we let them off the hook or any other company off the hook? Hell no. They were held to task. They apologized. It's time to move on. And that's why I enjoy the new Hellion. That's why I still enjoy my SAR 48, SAR 3. Yeah, they bring cool stuff over. And their pistols are good too. The new 1911 Operator, I've heard great things. The new High Power is doing well. We're not in a position where we need to be doing infighting. You know this. I'm not going to preach to you about that. But we need to hold together. And we definitely don't need to get rid of one of the better manufacturers in our community. So that's my take on it. Let's let it go, guys, because it's time. We need to move forward. There's plenty of other stuff to get upset about that's happened much more recently. So yeah, feel free to comment, disagree. This is an opinion part of the video. All I ask is please be constructive and respectful to other people. That's it. With that, if you stayed this long, I definitely appreciate you hanging out today. I hope this was fun. I did enjoy getting some of my older guns out. It was kind of funny when I keep the bipod for this in an Israeli pouch. And when I pulled it out of the pouch, there was some old dust and sand in it. And I had to think, I wonder how long that dust and sand has been in that pouch. That's what's neat about surplus. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to help support the channel as we get into the middle of 2022, please check out the link to the Patreon page. We've got a Q&A session coming up pretty soon. That might be fun to get involved in. This is Misha, and we'll catch you very soon next time.